Sir Peter Lampl is the son of an Austrian refugee. He went to grammar school and then on to Oxford to study physical chemistry. He had a career in business and finance, mainly in the United States, and then returned to the United Kingdom. He founded and funded the Sutton Trust and is probably now one of this country's best-known educational philanthropists. Peter, the fact that you are the son of a refugee who had to make it for himself, what kind of impact has that had on what you've done since then?
Well, we grew up in very poor circumstances because my father came over before the war, and then after the war, he'd left Austria as a schoolboy. He basically supported the family and got qualifications at night school. So, for the first 11 years, we lived in Yorkshire. I grew up in Wakefield, went to school there, and then I guess my father was upwardly mobile and he got a job in Surrey, and I ended up going to grammar school in Reigate. And then when I was 17, at the end of my first year 6, my father got a job in Cheltenham. We moved to Cheltenham. I ended up at Cheltenham Grammar School. And it's very interesting because I think if I'd have stayed in Yorkshire, I mean, I kept up with some of my friends from Yorkshire. Most of them left school at 16. So I probably wouldn't have gone to university. Then when I went to Reigate, it was, if you did well, you were expected to stay on into the sixth form and go on to university. So I was certainly bound for university. But it's interesting, when I got to Cheltenham, if you did well, you were expected to apply for either Oxford or Cambridge. So it sort of brought home to me that I was the same boy with the same abilities, but because I kept moving locations, my whole aspirations changed.
But presumably that was because the type of pupil that you found in each of your schools at Wakefield, Reigate, and Cheltenham was different.
It wasn't my parents. It was pupils I mixed with, but it was also the teachers. The teachers had much higher aspirations in these different kinds of schools.
Is this sort of a north-south split, or is it a social class schools that have got more middle-class children than less affluent children difference?
I mean, obviously, where I grew up in Wakefield was more or less a working class area. I don't think it's a north class thing. I think it's more of a class thing.
It's a social class thing.
And then we moved into into a nice detached house in Surrey. I was in a different environment. So I really appreciate the importance of aspirations and raising aspirations for kids.
But would you say that your ambition, your determination to do well, it came as much from school as it did your parents?
My aspirations came from the schools I was at. They pulled me through. It wasn't my parents pushing me at all.
And then you did go to Oxford. Did you experience this feeling different, feeling as though you didn't fit or not?
Not at all, because we looked at some numbers, and when I was there, 2/3 of the student body were from state schools, and when I set up the trust, it had dropped to 46%. So Oxford was a much more diverse place in the late 60s than it is today.
You went to Oxford at that time when grammar schools, set up after the war or taking children from wider social backgrounds after the war. There was a surge of students like that going to Oxbridge in a way that doesn't happen at the moment.
At that time, we had the direct grant scheme, which were actually private day schools that were most of them called grammar schools. I went to one, Reigate Grammar School, which were actually private schools that were state funded, and they were effectively part of the state system and were classified as state schools.
Right. Okay, so your next 20 years or so, you spent quite a lot of time in the States.
Yes, I'd set up my own business in New York, and we'd open an office in London and in Germany, so that had gone very well. And I was very lucky to make some money, and I'd gotten bored with business and making money, so I was looking for something else to do.
Was it a deliberate decision, or were you sat here and think, well, I don't have to earn at the moment, I'm not sure what I want to do?
Well, exactly.
Come back to England to be a philanthropist?
No, I really came back, but the reason I moved back is actually I got married to someone who was living in London, so I came back because of that, and we also had an office here, so I moved essentially from New York to London. And I just decided I wanted to do something helpful. It wasn't a big thing. And the first thing I did was, after the Dunblane massacre, I got in touch with people who were organizing a campaign to ban handguns. And I mean, it was the most moving thing, because a couple of days later, there were a father of a little girl who'd been killed at Dunblane was sitting in my living room, and the father of a little girl who had been killed at Hungerford, which was a massacre earlier.
Yes,
it was showed on my living room.
Both in the 90s, yes.
Yeah, and it was so moving. I just said to them, look, I'll fund whatever you need, but I want to do it on an anonymous basis, which I did. And actually, that was a huge success. We had a free vote in the House of Commons.
Right. And about 97, 98,
yeah,
I think.
exactly. So that got me a taste for philanthropy.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you then, I mean, since then, you've worked predominantly in education.
Yeah,
so
almost exclusively, yeah.
Having sort of had a taste of philanthropy and realised the influence you could have, why then start the Sutton Trust in education?
Well, I was gone for 20 years, Estelle, and it just became apparent to me when I came back that there was this feeling in the late 60s when when I was coming through the system here that, things were changing, things were opening up. And it seemed to me, coming back 20 years or so later, that things had gone the other way, that things actually were closing up. I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, I went back to my old school, Reigate Grammar School. All the places were free when I was there. It was now 100% fee paying. So a lot of kids, probably myself included, who were there, wouldn't be going there. I went back to my college at Oxford. When I was there, there were loads of kids from South Wales, working class kids there. Virtually none anymore. I mean, the whole mix had changed. So it was just seeing these things. Most of my friends who were state educated were sending their kids to private schools. I thought, what is going on here?
But one of the things the Sutton Trust has actually done is that it's very good at gathering evidence. What you do is deeply rooted in a lot of statistical research. So, and some of it's quite frightening. I mean, of the research that you've done, what keeps you awake at night?
Well, I think probably the most interesting and influential piece of research we've done was funding the London School of Economics to look at social mobility. What's happened to social mobility in Britain? And they basically showed that actually over the last 30 years or so, social mobility has actually declined. I mean, the opportunities to move up for ordinary kids and less privileged kids have gone down. Kids born in the 50s had more chance than kids born in the early 70s of making it up the ladder. So that, I think that's very disturbing. And the other thing that's really disturbing, Estelle, is that we have, if you look at international comparisons for advanced countries, the absolute level of mobility in this country is actually the lowest of any advanced country. So that's what really drives me. And you've talked about the trust, but our whole focus is to try and improve social mobility through education, because there are lots of reasons for low social mobility and declining mobility, but education is a key one.
Two things strike me when looking at your statistics, and I suppose this is the debate the nation has. There's an argument which I think you might use eventually in this discussion, that the quality of education that children from less affluent backgrounds receive sometimes isn't as good as perhaps the best independent school.
Sure.
But also that even when they get the results, they don't get into the universities.
Yeah. We published a report very recently, actually, 3 or 4 months ago, which showed that there are 200 schools that account for 50% of the entry to Oxford and Cambridge, and a third of the entry to the top dozen ranked universities. So it's very concentrated in few schools. And we showed that it's not just based on A-level performance, that these schools actually get far more places than they should based on their performance. And there are thousands of comprehensives and sixth form colleges that kids are getting very good results, but aren't, for whatever reason, aren't getting into the top universities. So
is that they don't apply, or is it that the universities have a connection with certain schools and it serves them well to
I don't think there's
that?
any skullduggery going on here from the universities. We're doing much more work on this, but I think the main reason is that they don't apply. And then why don't they apply? Well, first of all, we've got this very strange system where you have to apply before you know your results.
Yes.
And obviously, if you're at a good state school or an independent school, that's not an issue. But if you're in a comprehensive and you're maybe the only pupil who's in that position, it's very difficult. Then we've got the whole, the aspirations and perceptions, and we have actually surveyed, 800 teachers who are responsible for advising children on where to go next, on why this is. And the short answer is that the teachers think the children are not confident about getting in, and even if they do get in, that they won't fit in. So there's a real perception issue of confidence. There's a big job to be done to change that.
I think what you're delving at really, it's this unanswered question of why as a country we've not really found a way of teaching children from all backgrounds to achieve their potential. I don't buy this thing that it's because they go to bad schools. It's more complicated than that, isn't it?
It is more complicated. I think what happens in this country, and I mean the international research on this is pretty devastating, is that children who come from poor backgrounds are, you know, a year behind more affluent children by the time they're 3 and 4.
That's right, yeah.
And then they end up actually in primary schools that are in poor areas, and it may not be the school's fault, but if you get a whole mass of children from poorer backgrounds, that creates some problems. We have this very socially selective school system. That's the real problem. I mean, there's some research that says 50-something advanced countries, we have the closest correlation between children's performance and parental background of any country. And you know, unpicking that is really an enormous challenge.
And what your research shows, as a cause for concern both politically and education, is that to some extent we've replaced selection by 11 plus or by exam to selection by house
Social
prices.
class, yeah.
So let's look at some of the things the Sutton Trust has done.
The first thing I did, I looked at the situation at Oxford, because that's where I'd been at university, and I approached the university with the idea of saying, look, you've got 46% of your children come from state schools, 93% of children come from are at state schools, 2/3 of the top performers at A-level are in state schools. Why are you 46%? Their answer was, well, we can't do anything about it because they don't apply to us. And I said, well, wouldn't it be good if you tried to get them to apply to you? And I was familiar with summer schools that American universities offer. So I approached them and said, look, I will fund a summer school if you will run it. So we got 64 children up to Oxford from schools they never heard from, first Oxford summer school, and 16 of these children ended up getting in.
So in that first year, from
in
the
that first year,
semester?
16
incredible.
of them ended up getting in,
Yeah.
and these were all new students.
Yes.
So that's what really got me started in terms of education.
And now how many universities are part of the summer school scheme?
Well, our scheme, we've got about a dozen, but more importantly, the government has taken on the summer school scheme, which was actually when you were in education. Yeah. And summer schools are now offered at the majority of British universities, so it's become actually quite a universal scheme, which was based on our original model. Yeah.
I mean, you must have followed that through because you're very good at evaluating your projects. You talked about the success of 16 getting in the first summer school. Yeah. What does it look like now?
We're up to something like 10,000 students have been through our summer school specifically. And we're looking at something like between 25 and 30% are offered places by the university where they were at summer school, which I think is a tremendous achievement. Yeah.
And do you think the culture in universities has changed a bit as a result?
Oh, it's changed a lot. I mean, universities are now, from 10 years ago, which is when I set up the trust, you know, the Oxford attitude was universal. It's like, it's not our problem if they don't apply.
We've got students that serve as well.
We've got good students anyway. Whereas now, all universities are now engaged in outreach and funding bursaries for students. So I think the climate has changed a lot. Yeah.
There's some other things you've done that perhaps we don't accept yet as part of the mainstream of a child's experience. And I wanted to talk about what I always call your Belvedere experiment. Sure. Belvedere, an independent girls' school in Liverpool. Talk us through that project, why you did it, what happened, what's been achieved.
Well, I think... as I said, when I came up through the system, the vast majority of independent day schools were effectively part of the state sector through the direct grant scheme. Most of the places at those schools were free, and it provided lots of opportunities. So it occurred to me that actually that whole resource of independent day schools, which used to be available to all children, is now only available to 10%, roughly, of those whose parents can afford the fees. So we got together with the Girls' Day School Trust, who are the largest owner of girls' schools in the country, and we picked their school in Liverpool, which is the Belvedere School. And we said, and this was nearly 10 years ago now, or 7 or 8 years ago, we said, look, anyone that gets into the school gets funded. And we did much more than that. We did a lot of outreach. We got girls from all sorts of backgrounds to apply. Applications went from 130 to 400. We changed the admissions procedure from a maths and English test. We had a verbal and non-verbal reasoning test. So we opened up the school. And the way it works is that children who get in who require funding then have a means test, and depending on their income and assets.
So the test is wealth blind.
It is what the Americans call needs blind.
Yes.
Yeah. So the scheme ran for 7 years, and 30% were on free places, came from family income of less than about $14,000 a year. 40% paying partial fees, and 30% paying full fees. So we had a terrific social mix.
Huge social mix.
Fantastic social mix. And the academic standards in the school went up enormously too, that we got brighter girls in who were able to benefit from that education. And the interesting thing is, because we, which is the Girls' Day School Trust and the Sutton Trust, were funding about 55 to 60% of the fees. The fees at the school were just over $8,000, so it was costing us $4,500 a year. This is in the last year, and which is less than the full cost of a state school place. So we'd actually opened up a very academic school, private school, in a very economic way. So the reason we did it was as a demonstration project to try and persuade government to increase the numbers of schools. And originally we said 12, but the vision is that it would be 100 or more schools. So it would actually remove the advantage which upper middle class people have, which is they actually have access to these schools, which the vast majority of people don't.
Was there a reaction in Belvedere from those families in Liverpool who might have thought, when my daughter gets to 11, I'll pay for her to go to Belvedere, and all of a sudden they found she couldn't get in because she couldn't compete academically?
Well, there were obviously some parents that were displaced, but what they ended up doing in practice, we haven't done the scientific study of this, but we know anecdotally, some of them actually ended up going to state schools, which is no bad thing. In fact, it's a very good thing. And the majority ended up going to less academic independent schools. I mean, there's a choice in Liverpool as there is anywhere else. So we displaced them from actually the most academic school in Liverpool to less academic, which I think is a good thing.
You do have this view, I sense, that if we're to do the best for our most able children, whatever their backgrounds, they do better if they're educated with other children, with children of similar intellectual ability or attainment.
Look, if we could just wipe the slate clean, Estelle, I would be all for getting rid of all grammar schools, getting rid of all private schools, and doing what, I was in Sweden and Finland earlier this year, and doing what they do.
They perform very well, according to
They perform very well, and everyone, by and large, goes to state schools. I mean, private schools just aren't a factor, and I think that is very healthy. But I'm above all a pragmatist, and what we've got to realise is that private schools are here, they're selective, grammar schools are here and selective. They're not going to go away. I mean, Labour government over 10 years didn't do anything about grammar schools. We are where we are, so what we would like to do is really democratise selection, is to say, look, it's not just the top 10% of income that can go to these highly selective schools with highly qualified teachers, but that we make them available to 100% of the population.
You've very much specialised, haven't you, in that area of education?
Well, I think people ask me, what is the Sutton Trust? Well, we're a charity, we fund projects. And as you said earlier, we've funded over 30 research studies, so we're a bit like a think tank. But what we really are, what I like to think we are, is that we are a do tank. Yeah. We do things that we think make sense, we evaluate them very carefully, and then we try and persuade others, mainly government, at the end of the day, to take them up.
Let's go on to that, because
Sure.
You've mentioned government a number of times, and that's what I like about what you do, because I think we're quite good in this country at doing one-offs. Government's very good at doing one-offs, pilots, and they never come to anything. Even if they work, there's not the resource to take it forward. And you've always had that attitude. You've formed a close relationship with ministers over the time of the Sutton Trust, because you want to mainstream the successful things of what you do.
The big one has been trying to do something about the whole state-independent divide, and that's politically been very difficult.
What's it like working with politicians? I mean, you are a doer. You like to call yourself a do-tank. One can almost imagine your frustration at the civil service and government, the machinery of government being very slow to respond to what you say, and yet you have achieved with them a great deal. So how do you find working with government and politicians?
I find it very interesting. I mean, the big problem is that it's just the changing faces in that group. I think actually I've dealt with, I started my trust under the Conservatives, and I think there have been 7 Secretaries of State for Education,
in a decade.
You were one of them.
Yes.
In a decade. So the real frustration is that you form a relationship with somebody and then they move off and somebody else is coming in. So I've been constantly having to establish credentials with new people the whole time. And actually, to be honest, it's no way to run a business. Yeah. And education should be run more efficiently than it is.
Do they ask you to trial things? Does it work that way around?
There's been some of that, yes. I mean,
do it under your name? And
yeah, I mean, we're trialling, for instance, at the moment, we're trialling something called choice advisors, which is advisors in local authorities to advise children on where to go next, and the government approached us. And we've just been asked to look at the whole issue of university admissions from comprehensives in poor areas, and they've asked us to actually do a review of that and come up with some trials.
So they're actually asking you to do the research and then come up with
some solutions. But more often it's things that we initiate.
You've also been around long enough to sort of see different government policies, and that's even under the same government. So I suspect, as you say, you started the trust at the end of the Conservatives when we had GM schools, and then under Labour, you've almost been through the standards, not structures, back to parental choice, diversity, city academies,
now
into
new
Every Child Matters. I know, but looking back over that, I mean, things change, and those have been themes. But do you think we're making progress? Are we a better education system than when you set up the Sutton Trust?
I think actually, and we've got some research to back this up. I think, in terms of overall standards, we've done okay as a country. We may have improved a bit relative to other countries, but not hugely.
Sort of a marginal.
Exactly. So that's okay. The big disappointment has been social mobility and social justice. I think it's been very disappointing in 10 years of a Labour government, over 10 years, that not more has been done for children from less privileged backgrounds in terms of their opportunities. So I'm an optimist that things are going to get better, but I'm also a realist, and this is a very difficult thing to tackle. We're swimming upstream. There's a lot of vested interest in the status quo. You know, everyone wants to do the best for their children, and parents that have financial means will use them to further their children's interests to the detriment of other children. So that's a very difficult thing for governments to tackle.
I suppose what government would say in response to that to some extent, the only way we'll solve this is to improve the quality of teaching in all schools. And I know it's not your responsibility, but the argument against what you're doing, I suppose, would be you're taking some of the bright children, you're taking them out of a school and giving them a set of circumstances where we know they will succeed. And you've done well for them, but from a government's point of view, that can't be a national education system because we've got, 60% left behind.
Well, I think, look, the bigger agenda is to take children from really less privileged backgrounds and less able backgrounds and give them a great opportunity. I mean, take the Belvedere example. You say, hey, we're taking all these children out of the state sector. Every year in the catchment area of Belvedere, which is Merseyside, it's wider than Liverpool, there are 10,000 children that go from primary to secondary. 50, we have a class of 70 or 72. 50 of those children come to Belvedere because they can now afford it. So we're taking 50 children out of 10,000. That's not a lot. No. And these children are actually very bright, Estelle. We're probably talking about top 2 to 3%.
Top 2 to 3%.
And I feel really good about the fact that I know all those girls are going to go to university. They're all going to be given a really good chance. So these are really able girls. The so-called creaming off effect is actually very small. It doesn't really have a big impact. And we didn't have any problems in Liverpool. There wasn't a huge hue and cry from all the secondary schools saying, you
We've
can't do
lost
this
our
because we're
brightest
losing
children.
all our brightest children.
Which used to happen under the grammar schools because it was 25%.
Yeah, but that's
It's
a different thing.
situation.
We're not talking about
Yeah.
going back to a wholly selective system.
Yes.
We're saying there are these excellent schools in every urban area. There are private independent day schools, and in rural areas. You could actually, we've looked at it, you could cover the whole country with these schools. And they would be schools for actually quite able children.
Peter, you had 20 years sort of in business doing, which sounds less interesting
No,
than the things we've
but-
spoken about. But I was going to ask you sort of, just to finish up, which has fulfilled you more? Which of those two bits of your lives have
Well,
you enjoyed most?
Estelle, it was absolutely thrilling for me to set up my own business, and I came very close to not making it. I was, after 18 months, I think I was technically bankrupt, but my accounting system was so bad I didn't realize it. So I kept on going anyway. And eventually things turned around for me. That was very exciting. And then I started this thing, as I told you, just based on wanting to be helpful. But this thing has been amazingly fulfilling. I mean,
It's full time for you now.
oh, it's full time. I mean, the first year we did the Belvedere scheme, I mean, I had tears running down my eyes because all these girls came into the school, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, getting this amazing opportunity. And it's really, and the number of letters we get, and the children I meet on
They'll
our
keep
summer
contact with you
schools.
for a long time.
Yeah, and it's just so fulfilling just to be doing good things. And then the other thing, of course, if you do something and then government takes it up, that of course is also very fulfilling.
Sir Peter Lampl, thank you very much for being with us today.
Lovely.